That's just receiving a report, so we'll move on to item 14.
Contract to provide desalinization subsurface intake initial screening analysis for a potable reuse feasibility study.
Right. Mr. Hagmark.
Madam Mayor, Council, Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager. Here today to talk about Phase 2 of the Subsurface Intake and Potable Reuse Feasibility Study. Give an overview, discuss a little bit about our approach and the scope and cost and schedule and recommendation. So as the Council may remember, on September 23rd, 2014, we had a very in-depth discussion about desal. And as a part of that discussion, the Council directed staff to come back and study subsurface intake alternatives and potable reuse alternatives. Subsequently, on January 29th and 30th, we met with the Regional Board as part of a NPDES permit amendment, and they included that language into our permit amendment, and we included some timelines with that. The first was the submittal of our work plan, which was due August 31st, and that was what Phase 1 was, the submittal of that, which we did get into the Regional Board. They're still looking at it, but we successfully met the requirement. And we're moving now on to the second item, which is a presentation of the findings to the Regional Board by June 30th, 2017. It does seem like a long ways out, but there are still a lot of work to get done. There's 3 phases to the study. Phase 1, as I mentioned, was the work plan. Phase 2 is the initial screening analysis of the desalination subsurface intake alternatives, and then completion of a potable reuse study. Phase 3 would be to further evaluate the subsurface alternatives that come out of the screening. So a summary of the Phase 1 work: we engaged the Regional Board staff on the work plan development. We also brought in the Independent Technical Advisory Panel. They were retained by the National Water Research Institute, and is a panel of experts put together in the field of subsurface intake and potable reuse. We conducted a public meeting in early August and received comments not only from the public, but from the panel that were incorporated. The comments that received by the public summarized support for increased water reuse. We heard water reuse quality concerns, energy required for new water sources, concerns about how we're going to power these energies or the water sources, concerned water use injection will affect groundwater quality, concern that screened ocean intakes will damage marine organisms, and that the fact that it is not consistent with the Ocean Plan Amendment, which is true. This isn't a requirement. We are not working under the Ocean Plan Amendment. Our NPDES permit was found that we were an existing facility, and therefore not a requirement that we comply with the Ocean Plan Amendment. Ocean Plan Amendment on the fact that we study before moving forward with any project. That was really the element of the Ocean Plan Amendment that we're not in compliance with. Comments by Technical Advisory Panel. A total of 50 comments were received from the panel. The Carollo and Engineers' response to the available review of the City Clerk's Office and NWR website. We've put all this stuff on the website for people to review, trying to make this as transparent as possible. I see the biggest change that came out of it was the removal of fatal flaw, which we had put in there, and changed it out with initial screening analysis. The feedback we got from the panel is that some of these items truly were viable options, but didn't fit within what we were looking at, and fatally flawed seemed like the wrong terminology to use on it. And so we've adjusted that in the work plan. So now we're looking at Phase 2, and the scope of work for Phase 2 is actually to complete the feasibility study for potable reuse and provide. We're going to go ahead and look at the regulatory and permitting requirements that do exist right now just for indirect potable reuse, but we will compile that. The Technical Advisory Panel will have a public comment on initial screening. So we'll do very similar to the subsurface. We will do an initial screening process. The public meeting for this will be sometime in the January, February timeframe will be that public meeting. The consultant will be looking to 20 potable reuse project alternatives that they'll be bringing forward. With that, they will be developing from each one of the viable alternatives what kind of capacity is really available from those alternatives. Then there will be a draft feasibility report and another public meeting to review that draft before it is finalized, and we hope to have that done by summer of 2016. Is there any questions on the scope of work for the potable reuse work? I'm going to move on to subsurface, but we will not be gathering costs in this scope of work. That doesn't preclude us or the council from directing staff to do that in the future, because we will be bringing this item back and summarizing it as we move into phase 3. That would be the opportunity if the council wants to direct staff to do something. Where staff is on this is there are so many things happening in our water supply related to the biological opinion with Kachuma, related to the safe yield of Kachuma. We have desal coming online and what its role is. Before running off and getting cost estimates for potable reuse, we wanted to make sure we're asking the right question. What is the capacity we need of potable reuse? Because that's going to depend a lot on those costs and how far and what's viable. And so we feel like what we need to do is kind of understand some of the pieces of the puzzle need to get an answer to Kachuma, desal, and then this kind of feathers into our long-term water supply planning, and we can ask that question of what we need X amount and what will it cost to do that, and that's the next part of studying potable reuse, but it's not part of this scope of work that we're doing as part of this regulatory requirement. So the scope for phase 2 related to subsurface. Again, we're going to be performing extensive studies of the geophysical condition, tsunami hazard, sea level rise, sediment transport, determining what is the suitable capacity given the constraints that we have, determining the regulatory and permitting requirements that would go into it, pull that together for an initial screening. That will be the advisory group and the public looking for comments. Following that, whatever survives that initial screening then moves on to phase 3 for additional research and study. And so one of the things that we're obviously looking at is what is the maximum capacity out of the various potable reuse options and the capacity out of the various subsurface intake alternatives. It will require further study, and alternatives that are technically feasible will be evaluated for economic, environmental, and sociological impacts. So where does that take us? The first phase was approximately $344,000. Right now, the contract before you is for $672,000. And the feasibility for phase 3 has estimated right now at $1.1 million, depending on how much, what comes through the initial screening process. All intended to have our final presentation to the regional board by June 30th. So the recommendation for council today is authorize a contract with Carollo Engineers for $672,042 to provide a desalination subsurface intake initial screening analysis and potable reuse feasibility study.
Okay. All right. Any questions? We do have some public comment. Okay. Missy Zeiskoff, why don't you come on up? And then James Hawkins.
Missy Zeitzoff, having to admit once in a while I don't understand things. I do not understand why the staff report includes the Regional Water Quality Control Board's adopted amendment to the El Estero wastewater treatment plant in the same conversation as the desal plant. This is very confusing to me. I grew up on learning about sewers in Malibu. That was a big issue for us. I see the words potable reuse feasibility study again in the same sentence as the desal subsurface intake initial screening analysis. I'm not understanding the intersection of these two issues. One is to get us water and to do it in an ecological manner from the ocean, clean it, drink it. But what is all this reuse of potable? Could someone explain, because that certainly did not explain it to me. I was hoping it would, and I read the staff report on the agenda report. Are we maybe talking about using some of our wastewater and cleaning it to a degree that we then drink it? And I do remember in August in the Independent, there was an article written by someone I highly respect, and I won't even say the word, but it started with P. I say toilet to tap. That's a nicer way to say it. Will someone please explain this to me?
James Hawkins, and then Hillary Hauser, you're waiving your 2 minutes to Mr. Hawkins. So, Mr. Hawkins, you have up to 4 minutes.
I'm glad I have a little bit of extra time now to explain the process behind potable reuse. Essentially, there's two different types of potable reuse projects. There's indirect potable reuse, which is the only kind of project that is permitted in California today, where you go through highly advanced water recycling treatment processes to produce a potable, purified water resource that can be used to recharge groundwater supplies. That's indirect potable reuse. Direct potable reuse, which is not yet permitted in California and is being examined by the State Water Resources Control Board, allows you to, I would say, take a more direct route to reuse of this water, the purified water resource, but it is not toilet to tap. No matter what is permitted in California, there will always be a step between the advanced water treatment and your household tap to make sure that all potential harmful constituents have been removed. That's what the engineered storage buffer will do. And that would be, we're not sure what that will look like in Santa Barbara, but there will be something like that in the end. Now to get to my regular comments. I first want to commend staff's excellent work in managing this drought. You know, the conservation programs we have implemented have just been stellar. Like the council was just talking about, staff and the city honestly deserves an award for everything they've done. I want to commend council and staff for delaying the desal decision for as long as possible. I don't think anyone took solace in that decision, but it was really the last possible supply that we had in that immediate moment. You know, we spoke before the council almost a year ago to the day regarding our proposal for a potable reuse facility feasibility study through RMC Water and Environment. Following council's excellent resolution directing staff to explore potable reuse, we put our own study on hold as the current Corollo study was developed. We've been very encouraged with the National Water Research Institute process for this study to date and have had the opportunity to meet with staff to discuss our concerns with the proposed feasibility study. We come here today out of a desire to be on the same page as staff and the city, because implementing any potable reuse project will take a concerted effort from a diverse coalition. With that said, we do have outstanding concerns with the proposed study, because as currently designed, it will not allow for the full analysis of potable reuse feasibility. Simply put, we believe this study cannot wait. We must pursue an expanded recycled water plan now, not later. We cannot wait until all information on Conchuma is available. We cannot wait until the next long-term water supply plan commences. And we cannot wait for an end to this drought. The fact is that the information gleaned from the complete analysis of potable reuse is relevant and pertinent even today, because a potable reuse project could be used to augment the desalination plant's current capacity, replace it outright, or expand the city's water supply beyond the desalination plant's current capacity. It is important to note that Heal the Ocean's own research, as shown in our recently released white paper, which I believe you all received a copy of, shows that potable reuse could be cheaper and less energy intensive than desalination. We cannot wait to pursue a water supply with so much potential to the city. Our recommendation to council is simple: direct staff to modify the work plan as proposed so neither the production or recharge capacity of a potable reuse project prevents the full social, environmental, and economic feasibility analysis of potable reuse. We cannot wait. 5 years from now, I do not want us to ask how much better off we'd be if we had a potable reuse project recharging our groundwater or a first of its kind direct potable reuse project in place. We must move forward with full analysis of potable reuse feasibility and an expanded recycled water program. We cannot wait. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it's to the council. Mr. Hart?
All right, so I want to understand more the difference between staff's position about the analysis of the potable reuse feasibility and Heal the Ocean's position. And I think when I was speaking with Ms. Bjork about this, it has to do with whether you do 35% design for the potable reuse facility. Is that fundamentally the difference in?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart, we did meet yesterday with Hillary and James and talked about it. And fundamentally, I think we're on the same page in this. It's just a matter of the steps that we go through to get there. I hear their urgency and appreciate their passion to make this happen, but we see it more as an iterative process in a bigger picture of our supplies, and we think we need to gather this information. This is going to be immensely critical in helping us to develop our water supply plan. We don't believe that potable reuse really is viable for another probably 10 years. We feel it's still out there. There's some big agencies that are experimenting with it. Obviously, the regulators just want to make sure that when this is implemented, there isn't a problem. Because if there's a problem, it's going to steer people away from it for decades to come. And so I think they're cautiously moving forward with it, which is frustrating. I don't think it's a matter of if, but when. And we feel at this point that the best information we can gather is what is the capacity and what are the options for actually implementing some type of potable reuse project. We don't feel that there would be any value in developing costs at this point. We feel that potentially could scare a lot of people off, because if we're out there trying to implement this huge potable reuse project, millions and millions of dollars could tarnish that approach. And what we want to do is be a little more surgical. Here's our water supply plan. Here's how potable reuse could fit in. We need a capacity of X. These are the options that develop that would meet that criteria. And then we'd go off and explore those as part of another phase of the potable reuse study. We certainly don't see this as the end of the road.
So are you going to end up backing into the analysis for the long-term water supply as part of this effort? I mean, it sort of sounds like we have a lot of different things moving at different speeds that are interconnected. And ultimately, it would be great if we had an update to the long-term water supply so that all these conversations would nest within that. But we're in the middle of a drought, and we're building a desal plant. We're talking about negotiating with Montecito about using the facility in a regional way. Then you've got these requirements for the regulatory agencies that you have to meet and to meet these milestones. So you've got a lot of things on your plate, and you're trying to manage that workload and still generate as much information as you possibly can to inform this larger conversation. And what I think I'm hearing you say is that you want to ultimately develop the information that Heal the Ocean is asking for, but that there's just a practical reality of how you can manage this workflow over the next period of time. Is that essentially what you're telling us?
You nailed it, yes.
Okay. And I understand that. And I understand what Heal the Ocean is advocating for, and I agree with it. And I think that the art here is the balancing of the timing of that. And it sounds like this is not the final decision about that there will be an incremental check-in as we go along this process, and that we may be able to revise that the scope of this feasibility study to include these costs if it makes sense at that time as these other things resolve themselves. And so is that true too, that this is not the last opportunity for us to address this issue?
Absolutely. And I'd add to that, Councilmember Hart, that we can move along with it, not in the work plan. We could move along with it and study it to whatever detail we want, independent of meeting the timeline that we have to do for the permit. And I hear their concerns that they don't want to see this languish after the permit requirements have been done, and I given the council's response, I doubt that this will be set aside, but continued to look at. And I just think it's the timing of when you gather those pieces and put them together, because there are so many right now. And it's like to remind people, we are still in the emergency right now. And, looking forward to doing the planning when this is kind of doing planning during emergency, which is really difficult. When I have people with level heads, and doing it during an emergency is kind of a tough time, and we want things to kind of settle down and understand where we kind of end up with Lake Kachuma, and like I said, where we are with Desal and our partnerships. And so I think that's the kind of the best time to start looking then at additional costing information and what actual capacity we do need from potable reuse.
I think that makes sense, but I do, and I understand the challenge of planning while implementing and thinking about the next increments of capital investments. And it is a challenge without all the information. So we're never going to get to the perfect place where all the information lines up to make this simple. It's just compound and complex, and it will continue to be that way. But I am very interested in potable reuse, direct potable reuse, the potential for that in conjunction with what we're doing with the desal plant. I think there's lots of economies of scale here potentially, and the more information that's available earlier will help inform smart decisions down the road. And I do have tremendous confidence in staff's ability to get this information to us, as demonstrated by what we've just achieved in the last 2 years, moving the ball from zero to being on the cusp of having the desal plant in place in time for us if we don't get rain this year. And I want to assure Heliocean that, from my perspective, this isn't going to fall off the table, that we're going to continuously be monitoring this. I know you are. And we appreciate that. And your regional engagement on this issue, I think, is extraordinarily important, too. I think, our staff is very focused in on our needs, our local community resource needs. You're helping to provide a bigger perspective beyond just the city of Santa Barbara, and that this area is ripe for that kind of cooperation and collaboration. There just seems massive economies of scale of working beyond our borders. But we, I think, have been very fortunate to have staff focused on our needs immediately, because we've been able, and as a result, we've been able to achieve a lot in a very short period of time. So I'm confident that we will be able to marry these interests, at the right time, that this opportunity won't be lost. But I understand why staff wants to focus, their laser on what they need to do right now.
White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I thought the Heal the Ocean folks made one comment that I want to second, and that is that our staff now is confronted, is on the hot seat every day with a very low margin of error, and is really being put through their paces. And we really do need to thank and commend our water staff, led by Joshua Hagmark, and Kelly Dyer, his associate, and Madeline Ward, for doing this work every day under a lot of pressure and difficult circumstances. And so thank you for raising that point. I should have said something on the previous item, but the work that's going on every day and this is an example of it, where, my goodness, in the middle of this, we're doing a study on desal subsurface intake, and yet we're trying to just manage our water supply at the same time. So in that vein, I will make the motion that Council authorize Public Works Director to execute the agreement as outlined in the staff report.
Moved by White, seconded by Francisco. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just had a follow-up question, though, on the Phase 1, Phase 2. Are there the proportional effort between potable reuse study and subsurface intake? Is that to be determined? Has that been determined in terms of what? Because if we talk about both of them at the same time, they're two completely different issues, and I think Heal the Ocean makes some excellent points. And our subsurface intake would be an enormously expensive long-term future project, if I'm not mistaken, on what it would take to actually accomplish SSI, right?
SSI or potable reuse?
Or no, the subsurface intake. Both of them. You've talked about that, but really we've got the subsurface intake as part of the thing because we have to, I guess. But really, the feasibility of doing that is also a very, very big and long-term and much more expensive option that we haven't included in our initial plan. So I'm just wondering, in terms of proportion of where we're going with the studies, phase 1, phase 2, then phase 3 has another $1 million line item that's not part of this today's resolution, but still, I'm curious because, I mean, at what point do we say one or the other, or do we have to do them together, or is there a sense of, are they 50-50? Well, I mean, when we study these things, how are we going to, are they joined at the hip forever?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, we are actually looking at them independently, and when we get done, we'll have information on the capabilities of both. So that's kind of what we're going through here, so that we have good information to move forward with long-term water supply planning, and the council can give direction on whether we want to move in a combined gesture to try and blend of some sort, or we want to start focusing our energy on potable reuse because that's where we want to see more development of water supply. But we'll actually have information at that point to say what's available, how much we can get from those supplies. And so, but it is a long road ahead. I mean, the subsurface, I think that would be many years of permitting to make that happen if it was financially feasible. And the potable reuse, like I said, I don't want to be the wet blanket. I do think it's going to take probably 10 years, and that would be government at the state level moving pretty quick to get some regulations in place, and that's a drought that's needed to really put the fire under them to move along. But there are a lot of, even with that, as you can imagine, from my perspective, there's a piloting phase. We're going to want to certainly make sure we can do it on a pilot phase. So there's several years of piloting any type of potable reuse. And I think that's, there's a process of getting the public on board. I'm just glad to hear Heal the Oceans. We're going to need all the support possible to make people feel comfortable with this. But, bringing them to a pilot facility, having them see how it works, taste the water, for us, building the confidence that this is something we can reliably, trust to distribute in our community.
And as far as, once again, going back on subsurface intake, are we planning to, obviously we're going here with the project we have, are we planning another intake at some point in some place, or replacing the one we're going to use, or is we're just studying the concept?
Just studying the concept.
You remind me with the subsurface intake, back up. The current desalination project, the $55 million, what portion of that had to do with the intake part? As I remember, it's a small portion of the $55 million.
Madam Mayor, I believe it's about $3 million, or it might even be less than that, is associated with the screens and rehabilitation of our existing inlet structure.
So if sometime in the future, through permit requirements or whatever, we need to, and it's feasible, and we have to somehow go through a subsurface intake, assuming we're going to stay with desalination, the bulk of the funding, where the spending that we have for this plant will still be intact. It would just be redoing something would be about a $3 million hit, not a $50 million hit, because everything else will still be needed onshore. Okay, I wanted to get those numbers right because that has come up a couple of times of short-term, long-term process. Okay, so that's on subsurface intake, and of course the planning and permitting and the environmental impacts of digging a trench or whatever it is that'll take a very long time to do. Okay, so now on the potable reuse. So I think I'm trying to understand, because I agree, I think everyone's on the same page where we want to go, and I want to thank Heal the Ocean not only for continually to come here and be good cheerleaders for what we're doing, but also speaking to a whole variety of people, finding funding sources to get things done, partnering with the city. It's been, I think, a great partnership. So I'm trying to understand the timing differential of what they're asking for versus what staff is suggesting. And so I guess my question is, two questions. One is, take away the state requirements. Let's say the Water Quality Control Board said potable reuse, we can start tomorrow. Just that they changed the rule. what's the difference in timing of what Heal the Ocean is asking versus what you're suggesting in terms of moving forward with a feasibility study or moving, towards implementation? That's one. And then, is there anything in this item that we're approving today that prohibits us from moving things forward in a more expedited way? I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, there's nothing in here that prohibits this. This would be the natural progression.
Right.
Should the council want us, after we finish this phase, which I said will be done by the summer, if you would like us to move forward with cost estimating on some of these, we certainly could do that. That would be something the council, we could direct staff to do. Our recommendation is to probably hold off because it all depends on when this drought ends. If it ends this winter, which I welcome a reprieve, then we can start really getting a better idea of where we are headed with our long-term water supply plan, and that would be the natural progression to ask, how much do we need from potable reuse, and start to explore that. If we are going to go through another year of drought, I think this document is still valuable, sits on the desk. It tells us how much is capable, but we don't know all the pieces of the puzzle, and it seems a challenge to run out there and start getting cost estimates for a supply. We don't know how much we need.
And what's the timeline of this particular phase here that we're approving today?
It will have results from the feasibility of the potable reuse specifically by this summer. So springtime, we should have results of that.
So really between now and summer, we're moving along in the same pace and manner as we would if we were just moving right ahead towards the potable reuse. But we're going to have a decision point in the summer to figure out what's going on and how to either continually move forward and do cost estimates or hold off. Right?
Yep.
Okay. So there's nothing. So I think we'll have to revisit this come summertime anyway, and we'll be coming. I assume we'll be coming. We'll still be seeing a lot of you every month for many months, even into next summer. I mean, imagine even with an El Nino rain year, unless something so dramatic happens that spills Lake Cachuma, and we're just saying the drought's over, we're probably going to still be in some form. We're not going to be at We're not going to be at year one of a water supply management plan. We may, but that's highly unlikely. So we will be back in the summer after this phase is completed, and we have another decision-making point where I think some of the issues that Heal the Oceans brought up, we can have a better sense of, do we want to push forward a little more quickly or not, depending on the information we have. Does that sound right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, I thought you were looking up something. Okay, well, that helps, and I think we'll just continue to monitor this as we move forward. So any other questions or comments on this? We do have a motion. All right, all in favor? Aye? That's unanimous? Great. Thank you very much, and thank you very much. All right, so